Deputy Smith, Deputy Cian O'Callaghan.
Cian Corla. And firstly, I just want to make this point, Cian Corla, in terms of, and I appreciate that the government is now looking at this and the Minister is now working on this, but the fact that it has taken this long to get to the point where we might have a 100% redress scheme is not in any way acceptable. And to have supported the 90% scheme as an acceptable measure up until this point, is what the government has done and has been the government's position, shows a complete disregard for people in terms of the stress and anxiety that they're under in terms of this being their homes. That needs to be said. I can't hear the Minister, but so
I can hear you.
So apologies about that, Minister, but I can't hear what you're saying. Now I want to comment on something that the Taoiseach said about this recently, and the Taoiseach said recently that we have to ask ourselves: is it reasonable to ask the taxpayer to fund the reconstruction of quite large houses in some cases? I'd like to say this to the Taoiseach. We have to ask ourselves, is it reasonable that people live in homes that are falling apart and unsafe through no fault of their own whatsoever? Is it reasonable that people are excluded from the redress scheme because they cannot afford to access it? And I mean, that's a key point in this, because the additional costs that people haven't been able to meet, the 10% and the other additional costs, that affects people who are not able to, who are in most need of assistance from the state, people who are on lower to middle incomes. One of the great injustices of the scheme to date, and not only in terms of that it was unfair compared to the Pyrite remediation scheme, but another great injustice of it is that the only people who would be able to avail of it would be people who had some additional resources. And of course, very few people in this situation would, not only in terms of all the anxiety and stress caused by Mica, but also in terms of the amount of people who've had to move out of their homes, and there is a number of people paying mortgages and rent at the same time, and all those costs. And we have to ask, when the Taoiseach says, is it reasonable to ask the taxpayer to step in? We have to ask, is it reasonable that children will go to sleep at night afraid that the house is falling in on them? Is it reasonable that people put their life savings and earnings into homes that crumble apart? Is it reasonable that after all the problems we've had with building defects, Pyrite, fire safety defects and Mica, is it reasonable that still at this stage we do not have the kind of independent testing and inspection, both of building sites and testing of building materials, that we should have to ensure that this will never happen again? Is it reasonable that the regulation of products from quarries has been so lapsed during the history of this state, resulting in these kind of building defects and these defective materials? And that is what has caused this situation that we're in currently, and this is what has put families through such huge stress and worry and anxiety, and to have that compounded by the financial difficulties of the redress scheme being insufficient is absolutely unacceptable on this. And Cian Corla, we do have to bear in mind a home is not just bricks and mortar, it's where families forge their hopes and dreams, it's where newborns are brought home, it's where the most important milestones for families are often celebrated, it's where people are laid to rest. It's not just bricks and mortars, and for that to come crumbling down and to be affected on this. And I have to say, when I was a public representative as a councillor, I dealt a lot with residents affected by Pyrite and also fire safety defects, and to hear their first-hand stories as to how they were affected by initially seeing a crack and hoping that it's just a settlement crack, and then over time realising that their worst nightmares are coming into play. And what they need at that point is full support, rather than the kind of having to fight every step of the way to get support from the state. And it is correct that the state alone here is not responsible, and the state should be vigorously pursuing the suppliers of materials and the builders that are responsible for this. But it is the case that the state has failed over the years in terms of building materials and testing materials, having a very lax regime in place. And until we have the kind of regimes that are in place in other countries around building materials and around independent inspection of building sites at every stage of the process, until we have that in place, and as long as we continue to rely on the industry effectively to regulate itself for the most part, we're going to continue to have these sorts of issues that are devastating for individuals and families emerge, but also which create a massive financial burden then for the state and for the taxpayer. We're looking at well over €1 billion on Mica. We're looking at over €1 billion in terms of fire safety defects in probably about 100,000 apartments constructed in the Celtic Tiger years. And the state has already paid out €160 million in terms of Pyrite. That is money that could be much better spent if we were doing proper regulation and proper testing and proper standards. And not only after the issues caused by Pyrite, Mica, fire safety defects, not only have the lessons, I think, not been fully learned yet by the state in terms of building materials and regulation and independent inspection and testing, you would have thought after the terrible tragedy at Grenfell Tower and all the lives lost there, that the state would be at this point would be very, very rigorous in its approach. And I don't know why the government has not moved to have the kind of regulations and independent inspection regimes that are in place in other countries. Why at this point has the government not learned these lessons? Why at this point is the government potentially going to keep the Irish taxpayer and the Irish state in a situation where it's going to have to be paying out these sorts of sums in the future again? And why are we putting families and individuals in that situation and the stress that they suffer as a result? So fully support this motion. Thanks Sinn Féin for tabling it. It is good that the government, under pressure from the protests and from the campaigners on this, is being more supportive than they have been in the past on this. But I have to say, Count Corley, if we don't have a situation where, in terms of independent inspection and standards of building materials and building sites, if we don't bring that in line with other Western European countries, we're going to continue to have these problems into the future, and that must happen. Gurv Margaret.